was a poet, and he wrote poetry in Hindi. And here's a bit of trivia about Hindi. Hindi is the third most spoken language in the world, alongside Urdu, but next to English and Mandarin. So back to the poet Bachchan. The poet Bachchan, his name is Harivansh Rai Bachchan. I was fortunate enough to study a lot of Hindi when I got to my hometown, which is South India, Chennai, because I left studying. I finished my first year undergrad studies in New Delhi, and my father got transferred. So I had to study 2 years of English literature and Hindi literature. Very, very fortunate to have learned this poem. This poem is called Path Ki Pehchan, which translated loosely means recognizing the path. And I'll first say this in Hindi and then I'll translate it. I just remember, this is from memory. He says early on in the poem, he describes the path and says, अनगिनत राही गए इस राह से, पर गए कुछ लोग छोड़ पैरों की निशानी. Translated, it means that many travelers went on the path, but some left their footprints. We as travelers on the path, the eternal pilgrims, used to follow the footprints of the wise. And in the process, we need to cultivate ethics, noetic ethics. In the article called Psychic and Noetic Action, that was written by H.P. Blavatsky late in her life, she starts with a discussion about 19th century scientists and philosophers. The scientists especially were smug and arrogant about how much they knew, and said that there were a few clouds in the horizon, but a lot was known. Some of these clouds became the thunderstorms called quantum theory and Einstein's work on relativity. H.P. Blavatsky focuses on their ideas about the fundamental units of life. And she states that the philosophers and scientists keep missing the vital point about the presence of the invisible spiritual part of human beings. It's a long article, and she spends a lot of time refuting the arguments of the scholars of that time to finally get down to the nitty-gritty, which I think is the most difficult part of her article. She starts the article by talking about the Gupta Vidya, or secret wisdom, and the ancient source of the secret wisdom, how it was checked and verified by countless generations of sages and seers. No one sage's words were taken to get at the kernel of truth. She surmises that if all these so-called scholars could just stick to the idea of physical nature and stopped meddling with the higher functions and phenomena of the mind without the depth and breadth necessary, occultists would take them a little more seriously, even if they made a few mistakes along the way. She discusses the scientists who tried to define consciousness and will using physical, material tools, and they fail because they refuse to acknowledge the dual nature of man. Looking at everything with their physical tools, they reject the idea of free will, calling it the collective hallucination of mankind. H.P. Blavatsky concludes in this article that scientists misunderstand free will or consciousness because they cannot measure it, since they define motion as molecular motion. Echoing the words of the occultist, she says there is more to motion than molecular. She talks about the unique quality of human beings versus animals in their exercise of free will. And this article originally appeared in Lucifer, but later we have it collected in the Theosophical Articles by H.P. Blavatsky, and this appears in volume 2. She says, place half a dozen animals of the same species under the same circumstances, and their action, while not identical, will be closely similar. Place half a dozen men under the same circumstances, and their actions will be as different as their character, that is, their psychic individuality. The second part of this article starts with a very important axiom. Occultism regards every atom as an independent unit. When a group of atoms form cells, they possess consciousness and free will to act within the limits of the law. Occult physiology and psychology postulate that within man there is an immortal entity called divine man or nous, whose reflection we call mind or intellect in man. Or to put it another way, students of theosophy talk about the higher and the lower mind, manas. H.P. Blavatsky calls it the noetic and psychic nature of the mind, the nous and the psyche. The glossary on page 234 defines nous as a Platonic term for the higher mind or soul. It means spirit as distinct from animal soul psyche, and it is divine consciousness or mind in man. Nous was the designation given to the supreme deity, also called third logos, by Anaxagoras. He talked of nous as the intelligent design behind the movement of atoms. H.P. Blavatsky adds in The Secret Doctrine, volume 1, page 50, that which Anaxagoras called mundane intelligence, the nous, the principle that according to his views is absolutely separated and free from matter and acts on design, was called motion, the one life or jivatma, by the Hindus long before 500 BC in India. 500 BC being the year that Anaxagoras was living. Now, the higher manas never changes, but the lower mind changes with each incarnation depending on our samskaras and skandhas. So the kama manas is dependent on these two. The Theosophical Glossary once again says that samskaras are the germs or propensities and impulses from previous births that are directly related to our karma, while skandhas are the bundles or attributes that fashion the personality. The personality thinks it is ego-sum. It is the I and being and acting on the plane of illusion, so well expressed in the voice of the silence. When waxing stronger, thy soul glides forth from her secure retreat and breaking loose from the protecting shrine, extends her silver thread and rushes onward. When beholding her images on the waves of space, she whispers, "This is I. Declare, O disciple, that thy soul is caught in the webs of delusion." The higher ego cannot act directly through the body, but the lower self does. The choice is there for the lower. Gravitate towards the higher, noetic, or the animal, psychic side. Here we observe the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde conundrum, so well depicted in Robert Louis Stevenson's story. The problem is that the higher self is unconditionally powerful in its own plane, but here, on the terrestrial plane, it has to act through the lower personal self. H.P. Blavatsky talks about Professor Ladd, a 19th century philosopher in Yale University, who comes closest to the idea of occultists when he says that every organ, every area of the nervous system has its own seat of memory. Theosophy and occultism add that the seat of memory then is assuredly neither here nor there, but everywhere throughout the human body. To locate its organ in the brain is to limit and dwarf the universal mind and its countless rays, the Manasaputra, which inform every rational mind. Now, since the so-called experts in the field refuse to acknowledge anything they cannot touch, see, or feel with their tools at hand, we need to depend on occultism to cross the chasm. Every action that we do in the waking life, like eating, enjoying sensual pleasures, etc., have their seat in certain organs like the liver and the stomach. A good example is if we tend to eat, say, at noon every day, whether you eat or not at that time, what happens is that we tend to find that the gastric juices are secreted at that time, and it's an automatic action because of the periodic eating at a particular time. The higher self, too, has its seat of memory and is generally stated to be in the heart. The impulse of the psychic works from without within, while the noetic acts from within without. Now, when we say within without, it makes more sense to talk about different planes. So the without would refer to the terrestrial plane, and the within could be any other plane higher than that. Every human organ and cell has a keyboard of its own, like that of a piano, only that it registers and emits sensations instead of sounds. Every key contains the potentiality of good or bad, harmony or disharmony. So man is guided by this double-faced entity. As beautifully stated here, H.P. Blavatsky says that verily that body so desecrated by materialism and man himself is the temple of the Holy Grail, the adytum, the Holy of Holies, of the grandest name of all the mysteries of nature in our solar universe. So, to reiterate, the lower mind acts upon the physical organs and the cells, but it is the higher mind alone that can interact with the atoms in the cells, and this interaction excites the brain via the spinal cord. This is not just molecular motion, but divine consciousness on another higher plane. When it originates in the lower mind, it is psychic, and the brain is the front door, whereas all the higher planes of consciousness are the inner doors. Further, H.P. Blavatsky clarifies in the last few pages of the article that the higher mind entity is the permanent essence of Alaya Akasha, Mahat or universal mind. Meanwhile, the lower or personal mind holds on to the astral light, the lowest deceptive element of ether. Now we can understand the difference in the visions between seers and mediums. The former has the noetic visions, and the latter is caught up in the psychic visions. She elucidates with examples. The noetic visions are mainly twofold. Number one, a condition of consciously paralyzing at will the memory of all the material organs in the brilliant light of the higher ego as done by an adept. Two, a being who in a previous life had attained a yogi state of holiness through extreme purity, as in the case of Jakob Burme. But there is a third case she mentions, and that is of mystic visions seen during extreme illness and suffering, as in the case of the provost, priestess of provost, pardon me. All other cases of clairaudience, clairvoyance, and trances are cases of mediumship and psychic visions, which fills the minds with dark and disfigured reflections of the earth's memories. The Isis Unveiled is filled with examples of this. What are the steps that a student of theosophy needs to take to prepare the soil of our being to work on noetic ethics? One of the first things is to know ourselves thoroughly and understand our weaknesses and strengths. In the Trojan War, depicted in the Iliad, we come across great heroes, Achilles being one of them. The story of Achilles shows he has a weak part in his body, his heel that is not immortal. Every human being struggles with his Achilles heel. Sometimes it takes years for us to even know what it is. In my former life in Chicago, I spent some time teaching English as a second language to many immigrants. To encourage the students to speak and write in English, I would put them in pairs with a sheet sectioned into quadrants. They were given verbs to practice, questions and answers in English. The most common verbs were like, want, and need. Student A would ask, "Do you like pizza?" And student B would respond, "Yes, I do," or "No, I don't." B's answers would be put in different quadrants depending on whether the answer was positive or negative. Similarly, when it was A's turn to answer, his or her answers would be written in the remaining two quadrants. The idea of these quadrants apparently came from a psychology course where the question was posed to pairs asking each one, "What do you know about each other?" The things they knew about each other were put in two different quadrants, while the things they did not know about each other that they learned from their partner was put in the other two quadrants. The interesting finding was the fact that we don't know everything about ourselves, and somebody else needs to remind or let us know about who we really are. Our constant reflection on our lives and our actions, and really listening to critiques by others, helps us to a certain extent to look at the struggles we face within us. And yet these struggles are a daily feature in our lives, tempered by our past and present actions. No wonder the Dhammapada says, "Difficult it is to obtain birth as a human being. Difficult it is to live the life of a man. Difficult it is to get to hear the true law. Difficult it is to attain enlightenment." As we examine ourselves after self-reflection and the critiques of those around us, we naturally question what is the right thing to do. What is virtue? What is goodness? Plato, a disciple of Socrates, tries to lay this out in simple words. In the little book called Before and After Socrates by F.M. Conford, a wonderful suggestion by Jim. Thank you, Jim. Pages 59 to 61. The morality of aspiration instituted by Socrates implies a constant effort of the soul towards an ideal of perfection. The first condition of any progress is that the goal should be clearly seen and distinguished from the false lights of pleasure. The clear vision of the ideal is knowledge won by hard thinking. Substitute the word manas instead of soul to connect this with the words in our theosophical texts. All our theosophical texts intermingle metaphysics with ethics. Our devotional texts are not just talking about ethics, but are profoundly esoteric and metaphysical. By the same token, the esoteric metaphysical books like Isis Unveiled and especially The Secret Doctrine are embedded with ethics. I shall give 3 examples to illustrate this. In the Isis Unveiled throughout and in the summary of the 10 propositions, volume 2, pages 587 to 590, H.P. Blavatsky lays out the dangers of the astral, the lower iddhis, as well as the true nature of magic by clarifying the differences between mediums and adepts. She's talking about ethics here. Number 2, Fohat is first mentioned in The Secret Doctrine, volume 1, page 16, as that which links spirit to matter, subject to object, and is called the dynamic energy of cosmic ideation. And later on page 119, volume 1 of The Secret Doctrine, H.P. Blavatsky calls Fohat in his capacity of divine love, eros, the electric power of affinity and sympathy. And number 3, when we talk of the cycles and of the journey of the eternal pilgrim, The Secret Doctrine, volume 1, page 17, in the second fundamental, talking about ascending through all the degrees of intelligence, from the lowest to the highest manas, from mineral and plant up to the holiest archangel, we realize how all beings are connected and understand the significance of universal brotherhood. Going back to the book called Before and After Socrates, F.M. Conford then gives the example of the word justice and says there is a normal use of the word in each state, and the implementation of justice varies with the state. But Plato states that there can be only one ideal of perfection, common to all humanity, one standard by which all customs and actions must be measured. Therefore, justice should have a universal meaning which can be defined and known. Plato calls it the form or ideal, and it is not based on the arbitrary enactments of a country or an institution. He concludes that on this knowledge and acceptance of this ideal, an unshakable foundation, a reformed society must be built. He declares that lovers of such beliefs should be the kings and rulers. The Bhagavad Gita and Hindu philosophy has long ago talked about the idea, calling them Raja Rishis. The struggle between the lower and higher manas is very well illustrated in the Mundaka Upanishads. The Upanishads are a part of the Vedas of Hinduism. Whereas most of the Vedas talk about the rules and regulations of life, the Upanishads lay out the philosophy and discussion of the journey of the eternal pilgrim. Mundaka is a word in Sanskrit that means shaving or discarding. So this particular Upanishads is preparing the neophyte for the teachings by shaving off all that is of the lower self. In the third part of the Mundaka Upanishads, it says, like two golden birds perched on the self-same tree, intimate friends, the ego and the self, dwell in the same body. The former eats the sweet and sour fruits of the tree of life, while the latter looks on in detachment. As long as we think we are the ego, we feel attached and fall into sorrow. But realize that you are the self, the Lord of life, and you will be freed from sorrow. When you realize that you are the self, supreme source of light, supreme source of love, you transcend the duality of life and enter into the unitive state. Sounds simple, but it's definitely not easy. We cannot afford to give up or get overwhelmed with this task, as it is often stated in our devotional books that this is the path of woe and is pitted with stones and thorns. In Living the Life by B.P. Wadia, he says, we who are resolved to tread that path must expect not to be exceptions. If our path is all smooth for us, then it is not the path of woe. Each one on the path gets his share of woe, and it is an equal share for all those who are aspirants to wisdom, who have resolved to tread the path, have to learn the initial lesson that there is one melting pot of karma in which all the karma, good, bad, and indifferent, of every true aspirant is thrown. To stand alone and isolated, but at the same time, to kill out all sense of separateness, is a truth to be practiced, and this is not grasped. Finally, the Delphic oracle says, man, know thyself. We as human beings spend all our lives and more in that quest. Thank you.
Magnifique. Magnifique.
Thank you, Shobha. I had my eyes closed the whole time, felt like I was in prayer.
Oh my God.
Just
Wonderful, wonderful.
such a beautiful presentation, very meditative.
Thank you. Thank you. I wish many of you had come for the earlier sessions that were done through Theosophia today. They were just remarkably inspiring. And I felt like taking notes and saying, oh yeah, I talked about that. I'm talking about that. So I wish, Desiree, you could have come for that. That was just so amazing today.
Sorry, I missed that. Was that recorded, by the way?
Yeah.
I don't, yeah, I think so. I think you should.
Sure it is.
Yeah.
It's going to be
I'll get to see it. Thank you.
website. Yep.
But thank you, Desiree. I appreciate what you said.
And I really appreciate that reference to Eros for Fohat as
Yes.
a connecting link between spirit and matter.
Yes.
It's really something to contemplate.
Yes, we are working on that with Wes in our secret doctrine classes once a month, and it's just amazing to see all those connections there. It's the article in Theosophical Tenets that talks about metaphysics and ethics is is so important for us as students of theosophy to constantly remember that we don't have to separate the ethics or the metaphysics. They're all embedded. It's all there. You just have to look for it.
Mm-hmm.
Shobha?
Yes.
And anyone who would like to raise their hand, feel free to do that with that Zoom way that you can do that at the bottom. But I just I wanted to ask a question. Okay, noetic ethics. So you have an adjective describing a noun, right? So in other words, you have it sounds like there's a strata of ethics or something like that. Or you could say, well, what about psychic ethics if you want to be a smart aleck? But well, what about that? In other words, is there some kind of a strata? Because one thing that occurs to me that on the psychic side of things would be kind of judgmentalism and something like that. But then noetic, wouldn't it have to do with, well, everything you talked about, especially, well, you went into Plato and everything about principles and metaphysics and all that. I was wondering if you could kind of speak along these lines.
Yeah, I think Pierre also mentioned that today in his speech, by the way. We really have a difficult time finding out what is the right thing to do. We constantly have, I mean, I'm talking about subtle differences. When an action is done, as students of theosophy, we really need to reflect about whether it could have been done better, right? Teachers, I know most teachers, good teachers, what they do is they go home and they think about the lesson, the way they did their lesson, and they say, could I have done it better? And it's the same thing with the way to do the right thing. I really think we have a very difficult time not only knowing ourselves, but doing the right thing. It is so very difficult. It's so much easier to do the easy thing, which could be partially right, but it may not be completely right, which is why Plato's words about the ideal are so significant. Ideal. For example, it is easy for us to take care of our children and feel bad when something goes wrong. But do we really feel as much for somebody else's child and feel bad when they're in trouble? Or are we able to look at anybody that we don't like and think about their children and feel good about helping or feeling horrible when they are in trouble? Normally, what do? We say, good, I'm glad that person's got a problem, right? And then we quickly have a talk with our lower self and say, how could you say that to me, right? So there is this constant thing going on, even with students of theosophy who know what's the right thing to do most of the time. So I think that's what makes noetic ethics so very difficult.
Now, Kirk, Jim, I saw your hand was up for a minute. Did you withdraw or do you want to let Kirk go? Or
Kirk, go ahead.
You sure?
Positive.
Okay. Thank you, Shobha. Really beautiful talk, and you brought so many definitions together too, but in a noetic way. So we had time to assimilate. Pardon me if you went into more detail about this and I missed it because I did have to step out of the room for a minute through part of your talk. But towards the beginning, you mentioned that one of the definitions of noetic ethics is that it's action from within without, as opposed from without within. And we have this description in the Secret Doctrine, this transition that occurred in the evolution of races, where the astral vesture, which at one point in evolution is seen as being outside the true self, the true nature, as we descended further into matter, became the inner, what we thought of as the inner vesture. And so now, what we sometimes think of as coming from within is really what HPV calls the more intimate astral, right? It's the that's bound up with our skandhas, bound up with the lower nature, with our personal desires, very personalized viewpoint. Even though we may not see it that way, it's one of the voices within us, right, that arises within us.
Right.
And so I was wondering, and I keep going back to this question, that if it's the case that conscience is really ultimately has to be the guide in terms of discerning what is wrong and what is right, what is proper to do in a given instance. So that ability to listen to the voice of conscience seems like it's the critical turning point of noetic ethics. How, and given the fact that we've got all these other voices within us, what are some guidelines that maybe you could point us to that would help us understand or tune in better to what is truly the voice of conscience as opposed to some other voice that may seem like it's arising from within, but it's still a very personalized nature?
I think the guidelines are there in our books, but we have to get the right ones, right? And today, I thought the most amazing thing was the chapter 13 of the Bhagavad Gita, where Pierre read from that. I thought that was the quintessential piece that we need to ponder about. Again, this voice of the conscience is there for most of us, but sometimes it's deadened if we don't activate it, right? So like you said, Kirk, other voices are being heard, right? But the guidelines are there in not only in our devotional texts, it's there in all the literature that we have. Light on the Path says it so beautifully, and it's just that we need to be constantly aware of it. Patanjali talks about it. Bhagavad Gita talks about it. Dhammapada talks about it. Voice of the Silence is filled with it. But here's the rub. The problem is we get caught up so much in our lower, and it takes us over, especially when we have pain, sorrow, and other tribulations in our lives. Leading our lives, making our daily living, everything is a struggle for many people. And where does that light of the inner come from? I remember this woman who was a distant relative of mine. She came from a village. She lived a miserable life. She wasn't educated much, but she had this spirit, this love, this joy within her that made her a unique human being. My mother was extremely fond of her. She was poor, so most of the relatives kind of ignored her. But my mother had a very special place in her heart for her, and I'm so glad my parents gave me that opportunity to see within her and not judge her for her external. But I now think about the fact that what made her that way? You know, her skandhas, her samskaras were probably there from a previous life that made her still be a happy, cheerful woman, even though she had a miserable life. On the other hand, we know people with everything going for them who are miserable creatures. So this is an interesting thing that tells us that if we are not born with the right environment, we can get some of what we probably had before. Like Jacob Burme is a great example of that. He was a shoemaker. And how was he able to write that amazing the amazing books that he did. Where did he get that? It was there already. So I think, yes, the voice of the conscience is important. I think all that is important, but there are so many pieces to who we are. And if we have the right teachers, if we have the right environment, I don't mean physical, I mean mental, spiritual environment, we can go far. But yet it's a tough struggle, nothing's easy. So I just think it's a struggle, whatever it is. But at least we have the guidelines for us. We have the footprints. We have the guidelines.
David?
Oh yeah, I find that it's interesting that often people who are very helpful to others in a certain arena, it's because they've experienced something in that arena before, like people that have been in jail sometimes for doing a crime. Later on, when they've sort of rehabilitated themselves, they want to help other often young people who are criminals, to find their real self. So it seems that part of helping others and using ethics seems to have to do with understanding the need in the moment, rather than. So we can have, we can read Plato and Socrates, and that's wonderful and inspiring, but somehow we have to get more particularized experience also in order to have another type of knowledge in the moment, I think. Right. Which is sort of beyond the metaphysics or something, or I'm not sure how to put it exactly.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. There are cases of people who have been in prison. By the way, I didn't even know the difference between jail and prison. I taught in a jail for about 6 months, and I realized a jail is a holding place and a prison is where you are sent after you're in jail. Right. So prison, how is it they come out and they've been wrongly placed there? There have been cases of that in Northwestern University in Chicago. There was a whole slew of students and professors who worked on this wrongly, and with DNA evidence, they were freed. I wish I could remember. It's called the Forgiveness. I don't remember the name of the project, but they were wrongfully.
Called the Innocence File.
Thank you. Yes. So that's and some of the prisoners who were released, no resentment in them. Where does that come from? I mean, that's a noetic quality. How can you not have anger? And by the same token, people who have had members of their family murdered by people don't have any resentment against them. They forgive them. Where does that come from? So these are qualities that are not easily cultivated. And so I think that's what is remarkable for me when I look at cases like that. Absolutely no resentment after being in prison for 20 years, 30 years. How does that happen? So I think it's a very difficult thing. And I think today I don't know who said it, maybe it was Pierre, talked about how difficult it is to do the really right thing, right? I think he mentioned that. To the noetic right thing, you can do the right thing, but is it really noetic? Yeah, that's the thing.
Well, if I can just, it seems that it really boils down to motive.
Yeah.
If we're so focused on the end results, I think we kind of lose But I guess for me, the motivation is kind of the telling, because are we doing it for a particular result, or are we doing it because out of our heart we want to help that person without
Right.
any kind of accolades or anything else? You know, there are people that do wonderful things, but they feed off of the accolades, whereas there are those who do wonderful things without even thinking about an accolade. I mean, they just move from one project to another to another. They're in complete action mode.
Yeah.
And that is kind of the Noetic way, because it's never thinking about results or, you know, how this thing's going to wave back. And when we were talking, I was thinking about when we had that little presentation on Wadia's archetypal knowledge, where there's absolute knowledge and relative knowledge. And of course, he defined that absolute knowledge as simply knowledge that never changes. It's always the same. It's truth is truth is truth. It doesn't wander around because somebody interprets it one way or another. The relative truths do that. They wander around. But absolute truth always is, was, and will be. It just is.
Right.
Right. And
Thank
I think
you.
that when the mind is adjusted in such a way where it just knows instantaneously what that knowledge is, not necessarily even can speak about it, but it just, you know, there's an affinity there. There's a, I can't remember the word that
Tropism?
I don't know, it's just an alignment.
Yeah.
But it's just a sensed alignment. It just, and it happens like that, where the individual knows, or they can read something and they can kind of sense it's not exactly correct, or it's right on target, because their heart and their mind are in this perfect alignment. And I think that's kind of what he was heading toward or trying to convey, was that there's an absolute knowledge, not meaning a knowledge of the absolute, because there's no such thing as that, but just an absolute knowledge, and that what is learned or known is unchanging.
Yeah. But it's true. But how do you get that absolute knowledge is the question, the $1 million question. I don't know who said this, but I remember my father had it written in a lot of his books in the first page: to dare, to will, to act, and remain silent. And then the wonderful phrase that Pierre brought out from The Light on the Path: the only power that the disciple should covet is to appear as nothing in the eyes of men. Which is such a beautiful phrase. That's the only power. And that's hard, isn't it, in the world we live in? Because
the masters worship the atoms as they would a god. You know, there's no difference.
Right.
Jim?
Beautifully said. Thank you.
Will you take a question from Jim?
Sure. Jim needs to unmute himself.
No.
He's got his.
Yes, I'm sorry. Okay, I have a comment. Maybe silence.
Please. I love comments. Please, Jim. Yes.
Well, I was thinking about what you've just been discussing, and when we think of the Socratic approach, what is so rich and also elusive about it, perhaps, is that Socrates invites an inner dialogue, which ends up taking a social form as well. And that's very important for the growth of a whole community or friends. But his notion is that when we begin, like children, at moments to question what we do, not because we're doubting it necessarily, but because we're trying to get greater clarity and depth of understanding, so that the possibilities of deciding in that continuous way grows. Furthermore, when you do this, you can begin to sift out and make distinctions that are subtle, but also important in dealing with all the nuances of relationships and the choices and responses that we face. But what is interesting too, is because a person that does this, in a sense, rises above the plane of kamamanas, because kamamanas does not ever question itself, really. So the notion of rising above kama, but the fact that you love truth, love knowing what is right, and love doing what is right for others, becomes the connection between the higher and the lower. Love is, Plato says, it communicates between the celestial and the terrestrial, between that which knows and that which is seeking knowledge. So as Socrates teaches, as we begin to question, and we do it in fellowship as we're doing it, and as you begin to listen and as you begin to reflect and question, what happens is you rise above the plane of culture and limitations and conditions to where the mind becomes on its own plane a perceiver of truths. Now, what is also Socrates said, when we really see what is right to do and we choose it in a timely way, this act of seeing what is right releases the energy to do it. Noetic insight releases the will to do it. There's no will problem because their heart and mind are fused. Furthermore, what I was drawing from Desiree, yes, we should not do things for accolades, but let's keep in mind that a very high being is pure in motive. They have knowledge and they know exactly the effect they're trying to achieve. However, they are detached about achieving it. Not that they don't wish an effect. You very much want to help someone relieve their pain. You better know what you're doing and try to do what you're trying to relieve their pain, right? But furthermore, you learn through, in fact, recognizing that at times you enjoy accolades. There are times when your motives are mixed. You're not afraid of it at all. You're willing to learn, you're willing to correct, you're willing to grow, people make fun of you about it. Someone can tease you about it. But in time, you get to where when you meet people who do good because they want accolades, you're not threatened by them and you don't judge them. You've been through it, you understand it. You can easily put yourself in their place. You keep your mind on what is really, and your heart on what is really important. So it has kind of a beautiful dynamic that unfolds in a person who's growing in self-awareness through the act of self-questioning to rise to a noetic level through love of truth and wisdom, and then bringing it down into the realm of the biosphere, but with a sense of free enjoyment and detachment and a willingness always to learn, correct, and do again.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you. Yeah, it's the question of humility plays a big role in this, right?
Absolutely. That's Socratic humility is why he can laugh at himself a lot.
Right.
He doesn't, like Desiree say, fall into the trap of absolutizing.
Right.
You got David, who's got his hand back up again.
Okay.
Oh yeah, it just reminded me, this might not be a totally accurate quote, but meeting the need is so important. We've all heard the road to hell is paved with good intentions, but meeting the need. And there's this, I think HPB's quoting someone else, but she says something to the effect that you don't feed cows learned dissertations on botany, you feed them grass. I always love that.
Thank you.
Right?
Thank you. Yeah. Depending where you are.
Right, exactly. The need, again, back to the need.
But there's compassion throughout all that process, whatever it is. It's not, a kind of contempt or, but it's more a question of we're all different. But we work together, right? It's like a teacher who I never forget this teacher I had in my math class. She waited till everybody in the class got it. And I loved that about her.
Hmm.
She didn't just teach for the ones who got it. And many teachers are like that, you know, and she waited till everybody got it. And I just adored her for that. And I, you know, to me, that was an ideal. Talk about an ideal. That was my ideal of a teacher, you know, caring about everybody in the classroom, not just the ones who raised their hands and got 100, right? So that's a good teacher. That's a noetic teacher, right? I can never forget her. And I think that's the thing about, you know, where is our mind when we do something? Where is our mind, right? Is it on the lower, is it on the kama manas, or is it on this higher? You know, believe me, we know it. We have read, or most of us here, and all of us here have read, and some of you have read much more than I have. And we all know. And but it's the hardest thing is to act. Hardest is to act. Somebody very, very dear to me once said, don't put anybody on a pedestal. We are all human. And I thought that was a very remarkable thing to say.
Is there anybody else who would like to, now's your chance. Going, gone. We only have like 5 or 6 or 7 more minutes here. Any other comments? Monica wrote in the chat, so wonderful, Shobha, your presentation. You infuse these incredible ideas with such a high love and respect. Beautiful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Monica.
Beautiful writing.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Oh, there is a question from. Okay, please go ahead.
Denny, you guys have something?
Yes.
Oh, yes. I just wanted to give an example of Wynton Marsalis and Jazz from Lincoln Center Orchestra. And he, to me, is an exemplification of someone who's noetic.
Oh.
Because not only does he have to deal with all these personalities of the best musicians in the field and give them enough time to play and enough coordination and harmony, but he's gone beyond that compassionately, not only to train jazz musicians, young ones, but also to be able to speak to social issues in a very, very compassionate way.
Right.
The interesting thing is, I'm not sure all of his life is purely ethical. Not that it's my business. You know, I know jazz comes from a particular place. And, but even whatever your faults might be,
right.
If you can swing in a way that's so compassionate, so uplifting, resurrecting a whole medium and discipline. I mean, jazz is America's music, and everyone kind of forgot about it for a long time. That he's just an example where every time I not only hear the music, but listen to him, and he has lectures, Harvard lecture that you can listen to. They're very, very insightful with the kind of intuition that's a kind of a more universal, higher intuition that brings everyone together. So I just, this topic, somehow it's hard to, as Kurt's question about what the criteria might be, it's hard to express it, but you can see it in other people, that great heart.
Right. Thank you. Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you for that. Beautiful. Yeah. There are so many people like that. Their lives may not be perfect, but some of the acts and the way they learn years later, I always think of Malcolm X, who who later on in his life, he said, when a young white girl came up to him and said, "Can I join the movement?" And he said, "No, it's only for people of color, it's for the Blacks." And then later he regretted that. And I thought, vulnerability and admitting one's mistake, how many people do that? Right?
Right.
And so that is shows remarkable character.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Can you take a question or comment from Miluka?
Sure, go ahead, Miluka.
Hi, Shova. Nice to see you.
Hi, thank you.
I'm sorry I came late, but what I heard was beautiful. It's always inspiring. Thank you for being that role model for all of us.
Thank you, Miluka. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
You know, you talk about people that were incarcerated. You mentioned prison and jail and all that. And I think, you know, they're being punished for something that they did long time ago, something they already regretted. Because sometimes people on the mat being upset or whatever was that they're going through, they made mistakes. We all make mistakes all the time.
Right.
And I'm trying to think about how many times people in our life or people in general are condemned because they say or they did something, and you keep thinking that person is still the same, and then people becoming what is called killing a character of that person because of one thing or two that is really
absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
I wonder how we as Theosophists of brother, you know, get rid of that so we don't fall into that as well, because we are learning, we make mistakes, and we are learning, and we can condemn a person forever for something that maybe doesn't exist anymore in that person's life or character. How can we work on that as brothers and sisters?
Right. Yeah. But you know, I think it's harder for people like us because the responsibility is higher, right? It feels that, but we are human. We are going to make mistakes. So there's this twofold thing, you know, within us, we need to be charitable to each other. And we also need to be cognizant of this, right? It's a twofold responsibility because like I said, we have all the knowledge in front of us. And we can theoretically say all these things. How are we leading our lives is the more important question. Yes, Anthony.
Thank you.
That's very interesting, Shobha. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. You know the exchange that was just made called to mind. You know, even in our study life, in groups of students, the prayer, may we bear no, and it ends with, may we bear no enmity to one another.
Right.
May we be nourished by the truth, and all that. May we bear no enmity in our study to one another. So there's always that danger.
Right.
Even students among one another.
Yeah. We are human beings. We are first of all human beings before we are students, right? So we are going to make mistakes.
Monica, could you read that quote? That
please.
You
yes.
updated the phrase, I think, or.
You're muted.
Sorry. Okay. Yes, I believe the phrase was to know, to will, to dare, and to be silent.
Right. Thank you.
And this just from me, to me, this seems to combine great courage with at the same time with the utmost humility.
Right.
Combine those two qualities is
amazing.
Remarkable warriorship.
Yeah.